So glad everybody's with us tonight. All right, I think we're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to P&P Live. My name is Heidi. I am a 47-year-old white woman with medium brown hair, and I'm sitting in a white room with photos on the wall. I am the community outreach person at Politics and Prose. Thank you for joining us and tuning into this virtual format where we continue to bring authors and new books to you. I have the pleasure of hosting our event this evening, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our guests, Judith Heumann and Kristen Joyner. Before we get started, we have some important housekeeping notes. If you would like to have closed captioning for this event, please look at the bottom of your screen and click on live transcript, and then you can select show subtitle. You can adjust the size of the subtitles by clicking subtitle settings. In addition, we're going to provide image descriptions as we are being introduced. You can click the link that we'll drop into the chat to get your own copy of Rolling Warrior. Lastly, if you have a question for our guests, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and add one there. At the end of the presentation, our guests will have time to answer some of your questions. You can also upvote the questions you like and want most answered. Now on to the event that you're waiting for. Judith Heumann is an internationally recognized leader in the disability rights independent living movement. She has served in the Clinton and Obama administrations, and she was the World Bank's first advisor on disability and development. Heumann is the author of a memoir, Being Human, and her story was featured in the Netflix documentary Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution. Rolling Warrior is the YA adaptation of her memoir. Kristen Joyner is a writer and activist who tries to tell stories that change how people see the world. Her writing on exclusion, inequality, and social change has been published in Stanford Social Innovation Review, Stuff, and other outlets. She lives in New Zealand with her family. It is my pleasure to turn the event over to them.
Thank you so much, Heidi. And Kristen and I are very excited to be here. Hopefully in the future, we'll be able to see many of you in person, although Kristen lives in New Zealand. So for us, it's 7 at night. For Kristen, it's 10 something in the morning Wednesday. So what I was going to do was first give a description of myself. So I am a white 73-year-old disabled woman. I use a motorized wheelchair. And I'm wearing a red blouse or sweater with triangles on diamonds on it. And we're in the foyer of our apartment. And I'm surrounded by postcards and drawings and pictures and plants. And you can look at our dining room, which is also the desk that I work at with my staff. Kristen, you want to explain? Give your image.
Sure. So I'm a middle-aged white woman, and I am wearing a pink sweater with, I'm sitting in our kitchen. There's a white wall behind me, and you can see a little bit into, maybe you can't, into our dining room. And I think that's it about where I'm sitting.
What Chris and I thought we would do through the first half of our discussion is to share with you how we met, how we began to work together, how we formulated the story, and I'll do 2 quick readings. And then we're hoping that you have a lot of questions that you can put into the Q&A, and that around 7:30, Heidi will come on and we'll start dealing with the questions. So why did I write this book? You know, I've had my disability. I had polio in 1949. And as I was getting older and traveling and meeting lots of people and doing interesting work, and I'm a storyteller. So I like to be pretty explicit on how I feel and clear about like what the story is. And people would say to me, well, you really need to write a book. And I'm like, no, you know, I'm a speaker. I'm not a great writer and I don't have time. But then around 2016, 17, 2017, when Mrs. Clinton or Hillary had lost, I had time. And a friend of mine in California, who I had met in China when I was working at the World Bank, Stuart James, had reached out to a company that he had previously worked with in California called Gravity Square. And they had reached out to me about the possibility of writing a book. And what they did was they presented me with the company and a list of resumes that I would go through, and then I'd pick people that I wanted to interview. And Kristen's was the first resume that I was really intrigued by. And, you know, honestly, it was going to be difficult for me to work with someone on writing a book. And I learned a lot. We'll get into talking more about how we learned from each other over the course of the 4 or 5 years that we've been working together. But Kristen and I actually spoke on the phone first with John and Kevin and Andrea and Jill, I think, and decided that, yes, we wanted to move forward. And so at that point, Kristen was living in San Francisco. And so we agreed that we would come together and meet in DC because she was also working in DC. And you go ahead, Kristen, from there.
So, yeah, so we had these matchmakers bring us together. And I, as Judy said, I was living in Berkeley, working in San Francisco. But I flew to DC so we could have lunch and talk about potentially working together. And Judy knew at that time that I'd spent most of my career working in the NGO sector in human rights and feminism. And so we're sitting at lunch, and the first thing Judy asked me was, so you've worked in human rights and feminism your whole career? And I said, Yep, that's right. And she said, and you never really understood or had a full understanding of the disability rights movement. And I said, yeah, that's right. And she basically said, why? And why do you want to write this book? And I said, why I didn't know is a really, really good question. And why do I want to write the book? Because I really want to understand why I didn't know. So we basically spent the next 5 years, we've spent untangling and discussing, and we're still untangling and discussing why that was the case. So, and the sort of ironic thing about this was that at that time I was working for a nonprofit in San Francisco, and I had to walk through the train station in Berkeley, or walk to the train station in Berkeley every day. And to get there, I walked through a campus called the Ed Roberts Center, which is actually the home of the Center for Independent Living, which is where Judy worked with the other protesters who led the 504 sit-in. And the Ed Roberts is an iconic, you probably know, but an iconic leader in the disability rights movement. He was very pivotal. And at the time, I didn't know who Ed Roberts was. I never knew he was an extremely important figure in the disability rights movement. And so it wasn't until I flew back from having that lunch with DC where I walked through that center and connected the dots. And so it was just very ironic. So when Judy asked me this question about why I didn't know about the disability rights movement or really fully appreciate that, it made me really think about the way that discrimination and ableism continue to play out to make disability invisible, even to activists like me who should know more than I did. And so when Judy and I started working together, we knew that we really had to tell Judy's story and the story of the disability rights movement in a way that would shift people's ideas about disabled people and the movement. And so, as Judy was saying, first we wrote the adult book, Being Human, and then we got a lot of requests for a YA book. And so we came to writing the YA book, which we'll talk about in a minute, but I'll stop there for a minute and say, Judy, before we start talking about the YA book, if you want to add anything here.
So, for me, it was really a leap of faith to work with a non-disabled woman, because my story is not all that unique, but it is my story. And a lot of what I think we spent time, Kristen and I, in writing the book was really learning about each other. And in some way, Kristen represented a large population of people that I wanted to read the book. So I didn't want this book to be one that only disabled people read or people working in the field. I really want both the adult version and the YA version to be books that people who are interested in human rights, in civil rights, in justice, equity, American studies, history, social studies, really see and recognize that disability is absent, and that my book and others and films like Crip Camp really can fill part of the void. But one of the reasons why I have always really felt that it was critical to look at the work that I've done and very much be laudatory to the others who I've worked with is because no movement is led or run by one person. And I know that really, really well, that we each play a role. And so I think we were also, in developing the book, going from the really personal stories which we tell throughout the book to also being able to really allow people to see how collaboration is ultimately what has enabled us and still is to be able to advance the movement. But definitely, we were so, as Kristen said in the beginning, we met in DC. She was living in Berkeley, but about 6 or 8 months after we had started working together, she and her family moved to New Zealand. And so that, to me, was like, okay, this means that we're not going to have back and forth visits, because part of it for me was she was here a number of times and we would spend hours talking. And as we know from the pandemic, there is a real difference between spending 3 to 4 hours at a table and not being able to spend 3 to 4 hours on a Zoom. So this was pre-pandemic, and we were really, I think, figuring out how to have discussions and look at where we wanted to go. And then Kristen would write. And I think that was another very important part for me, is that Kristen, as a writer, needs to go into her borough. And for me, I'm like, anybody who knows me, I'm a real extrovert and I don't burrow. And so, we would talk, she would write, she would send me manuscripts, I would go over them. We would have to go over them line by line and work on it. And that was a really wonderful experience, painful, but I think it was really a very valuable experience. And ultimately, I think the relationship between the two of us as a disabled and non-disabled couple really has enriched the product that we put forward.
Yes. So we spent a lot of time together writing the adult version, and then we were getting requests for a young adult version. And so we started talking about what became Rolling Warrior. And when we first started thinking about the book, about Rolling Warrior, or what would become Rolling Warrior, one of the things that we thought about was what had happened. As you know, when you write a book, well, at least a nonfiction book, you often write a proposal for that book, and your agent sends that to publishers and to see if they want you to write the whole thing. And so when we wrote the adult book, we got actually a number of rejections from publishers. And the feedback we got was that this was partly, or we think it was partly, but some of the feedback we got pointed at the fact that the book was about politics and government. And people thought that politics and government made uninteresting stories, frankly, to be honest. And so, in fact, one editor said very directly, I fail to see how you can make a story about government policy compelling in a very polite way. So it was something, as you can imagine, if we were worried about how to overcome this stereotype about government stories or stories about policy being boring for the adult book, we were even more worried about that for the young adult book. So this was something we thought about a lot before we started the book. And so we knew ultimately the adult book in many ways was a story about belonging. At one point in time when we were sitting at the table in Judy's apartment building, talking for hours and hours and hours, as we did, Judy turned to me and she said, "Who do you think is going to want to read this book?" And I said, anyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong or were told they didn't belong. And so that story always makes me a little emotional. So we thought, and that really ultimately in many ways is the story of the adult book. And so we thought it would be the same for the young adult book, and it is. But there was another element to it that came out when we started working. We put together a young adult advisory board to help us collaborate and give us feedback on the young adult version. And we started talking to the young people, and on this board was included at the time he was 15, my 15-year-old son. And I was talking to him one night about the book and getting his thoughts about it being a story of belonging. And he said, "Yeah, but mom, it was like, the thing about Judy is that Judy and the protesters are like Percy Jackson and the demigods. They're like taking down the monsters and saving the world. And that's the way you have to tell the story." And that really framed, and it hit me and Judy, it really framed up the story for us. And so actually, he gave us the first line of the book, which is the first line of the prologue. And so we're going to take just a couple of minutes, and Judy is going to read the prologue for you.
The thing to know about me is this: if I'd been born just 10 years earlier and my parents hadn't left Germany when they did, I would have been killed by Nazis. Hitler considered us, quote, life unworthy of life, end quote. If you were a young disabled child in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, the doctors recommended that your parents hand you over to a special children's clinic where you were either starved or poisoned. When the Nazis expanded the program to include older disabled children, the doctors experimented with gassing them. 5,000 disabled kids were used as a means to test new innovative ways of killing masses of people, which meant that we were the experiment for a campaign that was responsible for the systemic dehumanization and murder of almost 20 million children. My Jewish grandparents sent my father away from Germany before World War II, when he was 14, to go live with his uncle and two brothers in Brooklyn. he never saw his parents again. But in some way, he was the lucky one. My mother was only 12 when she was sent away to live with people she'd never met. She never saw her parents again. I guess that my grandparents on both sides were worried enough about Hitler to send their kids away, but didn't think it was going to get as bad as it did. A lot of people didn't know how bad it was going to get. So you can see why when I got sick at 1 year old and became clear that I was never going to walk again, and the doctor told my parents to put me in an institution, my parents were like, no way. Institutionalization was the status quo for people with disabilities when I was a child in 1949. You basically got put in a building, looked after by nurses, and your parents weren't even encouraged to visit you. There were all kinds of bad things happening in the institutions to people with disabilities, which nobody was talking about. It wasn't until I was in my 20s in the 1960s that it came out that disabled people were getting locked up, beaten, starved, and used like guinea pigs for medical experiments. We were considered mentally and physically defective. Disabled kids brought stigma to the family. People thought when someone in your family had a disability, it was because someone had done something wrong. Years later, when people would say that what we did changed the world, I said, all we did was refuse to believe that we were the problem. In order to understand what really happened, though, let me tell you a story about what the world was like then. Before we mobilized our army, took over the San Francisco Federal Building, and faced down the US government. So I'll begin at the beginning. So that's how we enter the young adult version. I mean, I think, you know, what Kristen was saying about how the book finally got picked up by Beacon. I mean, for me, I'd never been through this ritual of getting a prospectus written and having it sent around and getting rejected. So it was great when Beacon Press picked up the book, because I really had been of the mind that one of the reasons why some of the other publishers weren't interested was because it was a story about a disability. And so Beacon had a history of also publishing other books in the area of disability. And it felt like with their acceptance, we would be, you know, on a good trail to be able to write the book and get it out there.
Yeah, we really felt that the big, you know, although people were talking about government and government policy and that was dry, that really the bigger issue was this underlying unspoken kind of discrimination and ideas about disability, and feeling that a book about disability wouldn't be a seller. And this is something that we talked a lot about and the reasons for that. And we tried to address it in a lot of ways in the book, but, well, I guess we wanted to read you one of the excerpts, another short excerpt of where we really tried to address some of the underlying stereotypes about how people see disabled people and disability.
And I think one of the other issues is that laws and policy in the area of disability were critical. And what you see throughout both of the books is the fact that, you know, we were learning as we were going. And I love, you know, talking about some of the things that happened, because the disability community is so much, at that point, so much smaller, less financially supported than the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement. And we were very much modeling ourselves after what others were doing. But, you know, when you really dig deep, you see how in many ways we were flying by the seat of our pants, but we were driven by our commitment to fight against discrimination. And that fight against discrimination was very motivated by our personal experiences and by the experiences of others, people who were our friends. And I think another important part through both of the books is really looking at the expansion of the movement and how we were very much moving away from the medical model, the single focused disability labeling, and really looking at the pivotal issue, which was we needed to learn about each other, become friends with each other, because the overriding issue was discrimination, denial of education, housing, employment. And while the interventions might be different in order to remedy the discrimination, the fundamental issue really was using the word discrimination, which wasn't being utilized that much at that point in time, and as much having us believe in ourselves. I think that's really what a lot of this is about, how we, through our movement, really began to recognize that we had power individually and collectively. So I'm going to read this little part in the book, which is written about me when I was like 8 years old. Arlene, who is my friend. Arlene was pushing me around the corner to the store. When we crossed the street in front of my mother's doctor's house, some kids appeared walking towards us. Arlene shifted my wheelchair to the side when one of the kids stopped right in front of me, a boy. "Are you sick?" he asked me. I stared at him. "What?" I said. "Are you sick?" His voice boomed. I shook my head, confused. "Are you sick?" he asked, slowing the words down. The words echoed in my head. All I could hear was sick, 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 sick. This boy would not leave me alone. I wanted to hide. "Are you sick?" he shouted. I remembered my mother's doctor's house was behind us. That was it. He thinks I'm going to the doctor. But then I thought, wait a minute, he's not my doctor, and I wasn't sick. I knew I wasn't. But then, why was he asking me that? I became uncertain. Was I sick? Slowly, I saw myself through his eyes. All around me, light shifted. Shadows, words, thoughts, half-hearted conversations tumbled into my head. Everything in my life finally clicked. I couldn't go to this school. I couldn't go to that school. I couldn't do this and I couldn't do that. I couldn't walk up the stairs. I couldn't open doors. I couldn't even cross the street. I was different. But I'd always known that. It wasn't that. It was the world and how it saw me. The world thought I was sick. Sick people stayed home in bed. They didn't go to school. They weren't expected to go outside, to be a part of things, to be a part of the world. I wasn't expected to be a part of the world. I felt nauseated that everyone else had known this but me. Had they kept it from me? The feeling settled in as a cold ball deep in my stomach. Was it sunny or cloudy? I don't know. I remember Arlene was pushing me. We were going to the store to buy candy, and we were chatting. And I was a butterfly becoming a caterpillar. So, what if we open this up to Q&A?
Absolutely. Thank you for those powerful readings, Judy. Thank you so much. And thanks to both of you for your insights and how you wrote the book and why you wrote the book. We're starting to get some really great questions here. So just a reminder to people, it's not too late to put your questions in the box below. We're going to go get started with the first one. Okay, this question is from Cheryl Miller. Cheryl says, Judith, you are so inspiring. Where did you find your inspiration?
I think through my parents and other activists. And, if you watch Crip Camp, you'll notice that there are a number of places where when I'm talking, I like lean forward. And I think, I get energized. I really like being with other people and feeling the challenge and really trying to think about the way other people are thinking and challenge their thinking, to really, I mean, in some way break them down. And I think that's true for, well, because people's views about those of us with various forms of disabilities are pretty uninformed, because there's such an absence of representation of disability in the media, in books, on television, in the news, in films, on and on. And so, like any group that you haven't been exposed to, there are, fantasies of, and rumors and untruths that people talk about other people, whether you're Black or brown or disabled or straight or gay, what Muslim, Jewish, whatever. And so really for me, it's working together with other people, disabled and non-disabled people, and really allowing people, or really forcing people in some ways, to have to start thinking differently and to recognize that our objective is to be a part of society and to be able to contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The next question is from Martha Kay. She has a comment and then a question. I work with kids who have disabilities, and I'm thrilled that there's a YA book that I can use to talk with my kids about how critical the activism is for disability rights has been to their being able to have 504 plans and support by occupational therapists like me. I just got the book and can't wait to read it. What advice do you have for people who work with kids with disabilities to help them understand and advocate for their rights? P.S. I loved Crip Camp.
I'm glad you did. It was great. I think there are a couple things. I don't know what age group you're working with, but if you're working with younger children, I think you obviously work with them as much as their families. And so for me, it's really important to help the families have expectations that their child or children should be expected to get a good education, to be able to work, to see themselves as members of society. And really for me and many of my friends, when we were younger, our parents really made a difference, because they fought for us. I was denied the right to go to school when I was 5. Although I didn't get to go to school until I was like 9. My mom and dad really were continually trying to figure out what to do. And I think, the difference between when I was growing up and today is there are many more things in place. Not enough. I mean, there are good laws, but at the end of the day, there's not necessarily enough support for parents. So I think, as a good OT, it's also really to help children learn about others like themselves, and encourage the parents to believe in their kids. And also, I think it's important to help families meet children who are older and to see what success looks like and to be able to link up with other parents. So they're getting role models at the same time. I think role models are so important.
Yeah. Kristen, you're shaking your head. Do you want to add a perspective to that?
I just think that, what really hit me when Judy and I were spending so much time together was how often she was told she was wrong, that her expectations of being a part of the world, or her expectations of being able to participate in class, or, brownies or whatever it was, were just crazy, or her parents' expectations. And so I think, when Judy talks about, it's really a hard thing to, when the whole world is telling you that you don't belong in the X, Y, or Z, to believe that, no, they're wrong, I'm right, I do belong. And so, Judy talking about her friends and how important that was, is just, and those role models are just so important.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Tamara Hall. I've read the adult book and love it. I'm curious about what portions of the first book did not get featured in the YA version and why. So I don't know who wants to take that question. Do you want to start, Judy?
Kristen, start.
Kristen, start.
I have to think about that. Well, the YA version, we really focused on the emotional, the story of Judy and the protesters, but it's much more sort of, I guess, streamlined to focus on her emotional journey through, to this climactic moment, being told you can't go to school, you can't do this, and then taking over the federal building with this group of people, and then, changing the world for real, the physical landscape of the world. And so I think we just cut out we just made that story so it's shorter. So we made that story more streamlined and focused on the emotions of what they would have been feeling on that, both Judy and her friends would have been feeling through that whole journey.
I think, the book and the movie together for young people, the movie is really, I think, for kids like 10 and older. But I think the two combined really are great ways for young people both to read about the journey and then to look at the activism, because I think the two paired together. And of course, the movie and the book had nothing to do with each other. And the book got released in February and the movie in March. And of course, that was not planned either. But they really are, very well linked together. And I hope that, this version of the book, which was very influenced by young people, you can see the cover of the book, the chapter reformation. The book cover, from the hardcover to the soft cover of the adult book to this one, get more vibrant. And I think that's, personally, I think is partly because it's been well received. So I think, the books themselves and the covers really are a reflection of the energy that's being created around them.
Nice. I'm skipping ahead a little, but I see that Cheryl Miller says Crip Camp was my favorite movie of 2020. So
I'm glad.
Let's see. We have a question from Becky Rosenberg. She asks, Judy, can you share with us what new things you learned about yourself as a disabled activist while writing of your memoir in this book?
That's a great question. And I think the truth of the matter is I'm still learning. And by that, I mean, I've been doing, many, many discussions. And the questions that people ask me very frequently bring me back to moments in time that I maybe hadn't remembered. And I think, as I said in the beginning, and as we were working, to me, it's really authenticity. It's trying to be as personal and honest as possible. And I say that because there are so many disabled people who are ashamed of themselves, who have been told by society that we are less equal, and who, it is not uncommon for me to be asked to do presentations to businesses or schools or whatever, and to have people who I'm speaking to tell me that they have an invisible disability, but that they're not willing to disclose because they're afraid of disclosing. So, for me, I really can't hide my disability, but I can hide other things about my disability. And, a common question that people will ask is, well, I'm going for a job interview. Do I talk about what I need as an accommodation if I need one? Or I may not need one, but how do I judge whether the hiring manager is looking at me in a way where they feel that I'm not qualified because I have a disability? So in the film, there is this one scene where I talk about being thankful for bathrooms that are accessible. And it's not really in the book, and I think it's much more powerful in the film. And I decided many years ago that I was going to talk about toilets because it's something that truly makes people embarrassed. Everybody goes to the bathroom multiple times a day. Nobody wants to know about your habits, and nobody wants to know that you may need help. And so if you don't understand that there are some of us who need accessible bathrooms, that has so many repercussions. So being able to speak honestly and truthfully about issues that make other people feel uncomfortable, but hopefully allow them to really understand why it is important that we talk about non-discrimination and universal design, et cetera. Yeah.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add that that's in both books. And because at one point in time, when Judy and I were talking, first, sitting down, talking, she said to me, and then I had to ask for help every time, when I was living in the dorms in college at
Right.
Long Island University in Brooklyn, there was a step up into the bathroom. She said, so I had to ask for help. I had to go find someone to help me every time I had to go to the bathroom. And I was like, that was just such a huge moment of, you had to ask for help every single time. And so, so that's actually
the combination again of that and what I like about the film is there are a number of other disabled people there. And as I'm telling the story, people are shaking their heads because it's their story. Again, it wasn't just my story. And so, it was emotional. And my voice, like Kristen before, when she was tearing up a little bit, I think it's something many women do. But yeah.
Thanks. Cheryl Westberg writes, what is the age range for the new book? Would it be a good fit for middle and high school students?
I mean, I think it's a book which is fine for middle and high school students. The book is also on audio. For some reason, it came out in audio, and now I'm trying to find out what happened with the audio, but it's read, the adult version is read by Ali Stroker, as is the young adult version. So I think, it depends on the person and their reading. Some younger people are able to read at higher levels, but look at both the hardcover and the audio for those kids who might do better listening to the book. But if the child is an advanced reader, I would say 9 or 10. And I think you said Politics and Prose 12. So somewhere around then.
Ruling Warrior was specifically aimed at 10 to 14-year-olds, but our youth advisory board ranged in age from 9 to 17.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Big range. Yeah. I mean, I think that, I think in that 9 to 17, I think they're going to get something out of it, no matter that age range. Cheryl,
adults are reading also. Adults are reading the book.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cheryl just also comments, she says, how exciting to publish with Beacon. They are a thought leader in the industry, wishing you only the best. So that was nice. Mindy Reiser asks, did your Jewish religious heritage provide you with inspiration, models to emulate? Did Jewish religious figures come to support the movement?
That's a great question. I would say definitely my being Jewish has been a positive influence for me, especially having lost family in the Holocaust and my parents having been forced to leave Germany. And so I think my mom and my dad definitely, my mother was an only child. And so when she was sent out of Germany to live in Chicago with relatives she'd never met, she was 12. She was totally on her own. And she was a real fighter and a real survivor. My dad was sent to live with an uncle, and his brothers eventually came out. But, he had more of a family support than my mother did. And when they met and got married, it was very much wanting to bring more life into the world. And I think, they were definitely fighters. And my mother, in addition to work that she did in disability, was always very involved with the Jewish Sisterhood and was on the advisory board for a state hospital and was very active in our local community when the bank was doing redlining and all types of things. So I was really exposed, and we always had people in our house. We lived in a mainly Christian neighborhood, and my brothers did their baseball at the Catholic church, and we did brownies and Girl Scouts at the Methodist church. So we were kind of a mixture of many things. And where was the Jewish community on this? I think the Jewish community over the last 10, 20 years and more in the last 10 years has really been, the Jewish federations and stuff have done great work, but I think really understanding what Jews with disabilities have been talking about has been something that's been very important. Many of the synagogues now have working groups on disability, and February is the National Jewish Awareness and Inclusion Month, and many of the synagogues are bringing in disabled people, not just from the synagogues, but rabbis and other leaders to really learn more. So I would say that the community has been doing more over the last 10, 20 years, looking at activism. The Reform Action Committee, which many people will know about here in DC, is a very progressive group. And just one little story, there's something called the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is a UN treaty that 175 countries have ratified. Unfortunately, the US has not. But there was a coalition when I was over at State of religious groups. And I went to a meeting once, and there were like 32 Jewish groups listed. And, we're not that large a community, 7 million in the whole country. And I was so proud, honestly, that so many of these groups really were seeing the importance of this.
We have a question from Tony Popkin. First, I saw President Obama had your movie on his top 10, which is such a great honor for you, I can imagine. And then the question is, my question is, how do we who have a disability help to educate people who work in either the medical profession or who work with disability rights really understand to listen to us about what we need instead of jumping to a conclusion?
I think it's, I wish there was an answer, and I know there isn't an answer. I really believe that being able to break bread together, meet with people, learn about each other is very important. And there are many ways that can be had. I think training specifically in medical schools, in regular businesses, about who we are and learning from the people within those institutions. And in the case of the medical profession, learning from disabled people themselves and family members is very important, because, Trevor Noah, I think, said it unintentionally very well when he used the word able-bodied when I was being interviewed. And I said, I don't use the word able-bodied, I use the word non-disabled, because you will, at one point in your life, be temporarily or permanently disabled. And he said, are you threatening me? And, the more I thought about that word, I thought he probably, it was completely unplanned. So it was a word that just instinctively came out.
Mhm.
And I really believe it's the right word.
Mhm.
And it's one that people don't like to use. But we are afraid of the unknown. And I think certainly in the area of disability, there are things that you don't know. But one of the important parts of the books, the movement, the many books that other people are writing, is that we're not just telling our story for ourselves. For me, it's like telling the story so that other people can recognize polio, COVID-19, nobody expected any of it, whatever it may be. And that the more we can be like looking at what is the disability community saying about what has happened with COVID. And one of the things that it is saying is what it's been saying for decades. Nursing homes are bad, congregate living programs are bad. The causes of them are not looking at inclusive environments, not having policies that allow and budgets that allow people to live in the community, building things that are not accessible, and thinking that you're never going to need something which is accessible. So to me, the answer is break things down, put a disability lens on everything that's happening to allow discussions to happen. And then, I think one of the values of many of the laws that we have in place is that those laws are obligating people to learn more in an indirect way, because you want to learn for yourself and you want to learn to ensure that the people you're serving are getting the best services possible.
Yeah. Kristen, did you want to add a different perspective to that or anything else? No. Okay. We have a question from Suzanne Richard. The question is, what would you have done differently as you look back and analyze things for your book? Or would you have done anything differently?
Kristen, why don't you go first on that?
Sorry, the question was, what would we have done differently?
Yeah, as you're analyzing things to write the book or the books. Or maybe personally, it could have been
I would, for me, I would have liked more time to be together. I think if there was anything, that would be it. Because would it have made the book different? In the end, probably not that much different. But yeah, I think we did an amazing job given the ultimate distances that we were from each other. And I think that would be one thing to look at how that could happen.
Yeah, I can't. That's a good question. I don't have an answer at my fingertips.
That's all right. Oh, I'm sorry. So Suzanne confirmed. She said, actually, I meant in the disability rights movement. So I think, Judy, she was asking about, would you have done anything differently? In the movement. Yeah, from, the 70s and up until today.
We would have had more money to do more organizing.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think looking at how, our movement is very diverse, as I've been saying. And racial diversity is nothing that's new to the movement. But I think it's very fair to say that disabled people of color were not equally recognized in the movement. And that's something that's really been advancing a lot over the last number of years. So if there really, I think, was one or two things, it would have been to be able to speed up bringing the diverse voices together, deaf people and people with intellectual disabilities, and certainly people with psychosocial disabilities and other invisible disabilities, and really allowing people to see that disability is, for me, it's a political term. It's an identity word, and that we not feel ashamed of who we are with a disability. However, we also describe what that is. That is something that's being remedied now, but having been able to do it 30, 40, 50 years ago would have been great.
Yeah. We're starting to bump up against the 8 o'clock hour, and we have a lot of great questions, but I think we might have to end on this one. It's from Lubna Ismail. The question is, what can people without disabilities personally and professionally do for more equity of people with disabilities?
Take disability studies courses, read more books, be more demanding, write to the industry when films are being done where disabled people are not being played by disabled people. Really raise issues in your children, your grandchildren's schools, or wherever you hang out to learn more about how are we putting a disability lens on what we're doing. You know, if you're involved in social justice work, if you're looking at violence against women, if you're looking at homelessness, if you're looking at issues around housing, you can't do any of these you can do everything, but if you're not looking at how the disability population plays out in all of this, then you're not really doing as good a job as you could. But meet people, have coffee together, be willing to be honest and forthright.
Kristen, do you want to add anything based on the time you spent with Judy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that once you have your consciousness raised, in the way Judy was talking about, you know, whether it's through disability studies or reading books, once you raise your consciousness to see the world through through the disability, prospect of disability, through someone having a disability, you can never see it the same way again. So no matter who you're talking to, whether you're talking to your kids or at school or in your work, you will always be challenging the dominant perspective that assumes that disability doesn't exist. So I think the first step is raising your consciousness and then allowing that to permeate your world.
And I think that takes a long time. I wish it was as easy. I think, you know, one of the things about Kristen and myself is we came to a project where we knew we had a bond. We couldn't write this book if she wasn't willing really to dig deep and look at why did she not know so many things? When she lived in Berkeley, one of the most progressive parts of the United States with very, very visibly engaged disabled people. And so I think that to me is something which is always very curious. What is it that people need to be able to really feel less threatened so that they can open the door to learn more, to better their lives and to better the lives of others? And I think it's complex.
Well, thank you for that. This is a very compelling read, and I hope that people will grab the book. We still have the link in the chat so you can get your own copy of Rolling Warrior. Hope everyone grabs that. Thanks so much to the two of you being here. I could sit and listen to you all talk about this for another hour, but we are right here at 8 and people had a lot more questions. So to those of you who had questions we didn't get to, thank you for asking. And those people who did get their questions answered, thank you for showing up. Thank you for being here. Thanks to the two of you so very much. And I hope that everyone gets a chance to read your book and see the movie as well. People were raving about it in the Q&A too. So again, thank you so much for being here. And
thank you for Politics and Prose.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you. And we hope everyone is able to join us for more events in the future. And hopefully we'll be able to see people in person sometime soon. So thank you all for being here. Have a great night.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Kristen.